I have to level with you here. As much as I like to think I'm an expert on all of the games ever, I do have one specific giant gaping weakness, and that is I'm basically PS1 illiterate. Heck, I can count the number of PlayStation 1 games I actually got to experience back in the day on one hand. In fact, for the hell of it, let's do it. Sled Storm, which I really remember because every game with a licensed soundtrack back in the day had Rob Zombie's Dragula for some reason. Chocobo Racing, which I played at someone's house going up against their older brother who was in his 20s. We played one race and I won, and I'm very proud of that to this day. I sat by and watched someone play Final Fantasy VII, and I hated every single moment of it. There's a game called Rogue Trip, which was kind of like Twisted Metal meets Crazy Taxi. I want to get a copy of this to talk about at some point. That game was weird. And I saw 5 minutes of the original Grand Theft Auto, and that was my entire exposure to Grand Theft Auto until GTA 5, which I still thought was a top-down game at the time. Yeah, I didn't have a PS1 back in the day. I had a Sega Saturn, and when that proved untenable, I ended up getting an N64. And the sad thing is I really should have gotten a PS1 because as an RPG guy, that would have been the most meaningful choice I could have made back in the day, although I didn't have any choice in the systems I had, honestly. I was like 6. I missed out on so many really cool RPGs and games that would have had really meaningful impacts on me. My point is, in that entire console generation, the real loser was me, because I missed out on so many things that would have probably shaped my life in a very meaningful way. I didn't start collecting PlayStation 1 games until about 10 years ago when I started this channel, and even then, my actual collection is so small, I would be embarrassed to do a full collection video on my PS1 games. I feel unprepared for that, and most of my games aren't that impressive. Fortunately, the vast majority of what I do have for my PS1 collection, I have to thank a long-term friend of the show, and everyone's favorite color with 2 sets of repeated letters, Vermilion with 2 N's, for selling me a good chunk of his collection at a very reasonable price. Because the fact is, I mean, even when I had a job to make money, I didn't have much money to buy games. Side note, feel free to support the Patreon or Ko-fi. Thanks, love me. But one day when he was showing me his collection and games he was thinking about selling me, I saw something really weird. I'm gonna have to dig back into Discord a few years, but I'll find the picture. You see it? It's the big standout, why is there a giant pink box in your shelf? Here's the thing, I recognize this box, or at least I thought I did, because I have a similar one in my Sega Saturn shelf. It's clearly Sakura Taisen 2, except that there wasn't a Sakura Taisen game on a console that wasn't Sega branded until the Wii and PS2, so what is this thing? Well, the short version, it is Choukousoku GranDoll, or Hyperspeed GranDoll, a game based off a 3-episode OVA that only ever released in Japanese, but the OVA was entirely in English for some reason. And I watched the entirety of it so that I could actually figure out what was going on in this game. And to save you a whole lot of time, Alien Princess wears cybernetic magical girl armor and anime nonsense ensues, and I've just saved you an hour and a half of time. You could better go watch, I don't know, the Panzer Dragoon anime? No, scratch that. That one was also pretty crap and actually outright offensive. You could watch the Virtua Fighter anime, or at least some of it, and that was actually goofy camp fun, if you didn't take it seriously. But the point is, GranDoll is a weird anomaly I got in my collection, primarily just because I wanted to see what this weird pink box game was. And it was certainly interesting. The story to GranDoll follows Hikaru, an average schoolgirl, except not really because she's actually a princess from an alien planet that got wiped out many, many years ago. She's actually basically Superman, except she doesn't have any powers on her own. Instead, no, she has a pet robot that's also pants, that's also a spaceship, I think? Either way, the game follows Hikaru going about her day doing standard schoolgirl stuff, such as going to school or going to the carnival with her senpai, or, you know, eventually going to space, as you do, and sci-fi magical girl nonsense ensues. That's basically all you really need to know about the plot. I've watched the entire OVA series, and, like, it's not worth wasting the time. It's a fairly standard plot without much going on. And the game doesn't really have that much going on with its story either, but it is more or less just an expansion of the OVA's plot, so yeah, it's not really honestly worth talking about. And to be fair, unlike the OVA, which was weirdly in English, the game's entirely in Japanese, so don't play this game for the plot is basically my advice to you. I think that the gameplay to GranDoll would probably frequently be compared to the likes of, say, Metroid or Mega Man, and I don't think either of those comparisons are terribly apt. It's a standard 2D platformer that takes place in labyrinthian dungeons that get bigger as time goes on, but it's an entirely linear affair. Hikaru can run and jump and shoot her little gun, and there's no reason to not just hold that button down and just keep shooting forever. You really should, because enemies come at you running full tilt off screen and can get really in your face before you kill them. So just hold down the gun button if you want to play this terribly well. You also have the ability to not quite double jump, but you can do like a little mid-air flippy, and I think this is important because you get invulnerability with it, and I think the game was pretty much designed around you trying to abuse this invulnerability as much as possible, because frequently there will just be all sorts of traps in really tight confined places that you can't realistically get around. You just sort of have to invulnerability your way through them, which is not an encouraging way to design your games, I'll tell you right now. And indeed, this game is fairly unforgiving in that regard. And if you press R1, you have the ability to throw scissors, which then can be used like a hook shot. And it's a very stiff hook shot. It's just, you're on the ground, suddenly you're in the air. And you don't have a lot of control while you're hook shotting around, and even if you're thrown off it, you don't get a jump after that. So while you're hook shotting, you're pretty much committed to it once you start, so it's worth knowing that. But the levels are designed with a great deal of verticality to take into account your hook shotting, and the fact that you can go through certain platforms while you do so. Now, your overall goal is to try and navigate these mazes, trying to get to a boss door, but it's not that simple because the boss doors are protected with force fields that you need a key for. There are a few pickups in these mazes aside from the keys you need as well. You have things that look like missiles. They fill the little bar at the bottom of the screen, which, if filled, gives you one bomb that could be used to screen clear a bunch of enemies out, but let's be honest, save those for the bosses. They axe off about maybe a fifth of their health. Seriously, save your bombs for the bosses. That's what they're there for. You can also pick up very, very rarely these little colored crystal things that restore your health, but these drops are very infrequent, which, yeah, it does mean you're probably going to die a lot, unfortunately. There's a specific pickup that freezes time for 5 seconds, except that it just freezes enemies and their hurt boxes still exist, so they're not actually remotely useful as a power-up in any real capacity. And then there's the thing that looks like a pumpkin, and these give you like 2% more maximum health, so you're going to want to collect these. The weird thing is, though, the 4th stage to this game, it's huge. It has like 8 keys in it for no reason, because while there are enough force fields to unlock, you only need like 2 to get to the boss. The rest are just red herrings for some reason. But this stage is so big that they decided every stage before this had 2 permanent health increases. Let's throw like 20 in this one for some reason. And then, of course, this game doesn't have checkpoints, so if you die at any point after collecting all this, you have to recollect them or make do with less health, because the 4th stage in this game is absolute pain. But your main goal is to get the key and get to the boss. Now, once you get to the boss, when you actually get to the, when you get to the boss, there's a oh, come on! Yeah, okay, I don't want to paint the bosses in a bad light, but this game does an excellent job of it to begin with. This is the first boss. She is by far the hardest boss in this game. And I don't mean that in the sense that, well, you fight her early so you're fairly weak, so she must be easier if you were to fight her later. No, because you fight her 3 times over the course of the game, and she is unbelievably hard. In fact, she gets harder as time goes on. Even when you have the most amount of health you possibly can in the final stages, she can axe half your health in one move. She is a genuinely scary fight, and the only thing that makes the final fight against her easier is she's got so much going on with her at that point, the game struggles to keep up with her, so you can actually time your little invulnerability flippies to get around stuff. And indeed, I think she's designed primarily to be a tutorial that you really do need to use your invulnerability flips. And I say that because not only can she attack you just off screen where you're unprepared as to where she is, but she, in her basic move set, which expands every time you fight her, one of her most basic moves is she shoots a triple shot where every single shot can home in on you, and she can do this off screen. You need to really master the invulnerability flippy. She is an absurdly hard first boss, and this just shows how weirdly balanced they are, because every single boss after this, aside from her refights, you can face tank each one with no problems. This lady is just absurdly difficult for a first boss, and she doesn't get easier as time goes on. But if you can actually manage to beat her, which took me about an hour, you then gain a new set of armor, which wasn't really expanded upon much in the OVAs because Hikaru pretty much just stuck to her main outfit. And the thing about these armors is they completely change up her moveset. Unfortunately, this also means that every single stage is pretty much gimmickly themed around the previous unlockable suit because they really wanted to take advantage of the specific abilities of the previous suit. The first suit that you get from this lady is, I think it's called the Aggressor suit, but I call it the Scorpion scorpion because you get claws, and you get twin shot lasers, which are actually like bigger than your main shot, and they do substantially more damage. And instead of a hook shot, you can suddenly start climbing walls. After this, you get a giant suit of like tunnel rhino armor that allows you to shoot bombs at stuff really slow and awkwardly, but you also get a super wide shot, but it's very, very weak. In fact, every shot aside from the scorpion armor shot does less damage than your standard shot for some reason, even though the scorpion shot is slightly bigger than your regular shot because balancing. You also get a suit that allows you to dash around and get a actual double jump, and this suit is super, super useful. Unfortunately, the stage after it is so built vertically and designed in such an obnoxious way that there's like 8 cards hidden around it, and it's entirely built vertically, and if you get knocked off by anything, you fall all the way back to the bottom of the tower. It is a moment of severe pain in vertical stage design. I've been harping against games doing this since the original Mega Man. Vertical stage design is a bad idea, just in general, but when you throw so many enemies that quickly respawn on you, as well as traps that are just lining the walls and basically every platform, it's very easy to make a mistake and just end up at the start, which to be fair is a whole genre of games on Steam now that got really popular last year, although they could probably date all the way back to Getting Over It, but this is not the point. Those were designed to be frustrating, which is actively acknowledging that this kind of stage design is fundamentally bad. And then finally, you get the Master Armor, which allows you to just straight up fly, which would be great. Like, seriously, that would be satisfying, it would be fun, it would be an awesome reward to play around with. Heck, you could even probably do some fun New Game Plus stuff with something like this, right? Yeah, well, the stage that you play immediately after it, the 5th stage, I only got about 3 rooms in. And that's because the 3rd room decided to do the one cardinal sin you never want to see a good import do that you're having fun with, which to be fair at this point I wasn't, I was just frustrated with it, but regardless. It pulls out a quiz out of nowhere, and if you get even one question in the quiz wrong, you have to start the level over. And this is the first question, to which I could only respond with a hearty, "Bah?" So I hope you are actively translating or reading every single bit of dialogue to understand what Hikaru's favorite special effects program is, because I had no idea and I gave up at this point. But to be fair, this is exactly the thing I want to check for in imports that are actually fun or worth having, because the moment it does this, I can tell you it's not worth having. The fact is, Hyperspeed GranDoll up to this point was actually kind of fun. The stage designs were frustrating, and sure, there were traps everywhere, and there are no continues in stages. You just start back at the beginning if you die, unless you die at a boss. And what's nice about this is later on there's like 3 bosses stacked back to back, and there's actually a checkpoint between each one of them, which is a weird mercy for this game because it's really an unforgiving, cruel, cruel game. But I was still kinda having fun through the frustration. But then they just throw a quiz at you out of nowhere, and I have no idea why so many Japanese platform games have quizzes in them. Let's just, for a minute, remove the language barrier. Assuming that this quiz was entirely in English, or alternatively, that I could completely understand Japanese, so the quiz was functionally no problem whatsoever. Even if that's the case, this is an action platformer, and if I can handle the quiz to the point where it's not a problem, it still completely breaks the pacing and flow of the game and just stop it entirely. And I never understood why these are in these kind of games, because the game itself doesn't benefit it in any way whatsoever. While this game is hardly perfect and it is mostly frustrating up to this point, I was still at least having fun. This kind of kills any sort of recommendation I can give to anyone unless you can actively read Japanese, because you just won't be able to get through this unless you try and brute force your way through, which means that you'll probably get the questions wrong, which means you'll have to redo the stage bits. And here's the thing, health drops in this game are wildly infrequent. So you're going to be taking damage and you're going to be losing health, and as you move through the stage over and over, you're going to be making less and less seeming progress because you're losing more and more health. And that sucks. I have no idea why this is a design decision anyone thought was a good idea, and it's frustrating. So yeah, GranDoll is at its core kind of a clunky, clumsy platformer It utilizes some interesting movement mechanics, and it has an ever-expanding set of abilities with every suit of armor you get, having something new, which is great, but the stage design is completely dickish. They're very, very gimmicky based on whatever armor you just got, so that's basically all you use, and it's just outright frustrating how labyrinthian some of the stages are designed, plus the bosses are just awful. Well, one specifically because she's too hard, and the rest because they're unbelievably easy. Also, transforming into your new suits takes about 5 seconds in between, and on the latter stages, you kind of have to do it like every platform you jump on, so the latter stages, especially stage 4, is just slow, awkwardly paced, and just frustrating. There's no checkpoints, it doesn't remember when you've picked up health expansions, so you have to do it every single time, and because of how cruel the stage design is, you'll be doing it a lot because death is basically an inevitability. And yet, I kinda like this game all the same for all of its clunky, janky charm, at least up until the point where it hit me with a quiz that basically walled me. I gave up at that point, and I can't recommend it as an import for you because of that. It's just bad. The overall presentation to GranDoll, conversely, is actually quite good. The sprites look fantastic. I love the individual armors. There's actually a different game over screen depending on which armor you're wearing at the time, which is really cool. I think that's a cute little bit of extra effort put in there. If there is a weak point with the visual design, it is that the environments themselves largely feel like just sort of generic industrial complex maze. And because of that, they do feel very, very similar visually, and they're not that interesting. And likewise, the standard enemies just feel like average, samey robots, and there aren't that many of them, but they do go to the point where they recolor them, which feels a little lazy. And the sound design is awesome. First of all, it's fully voice acted in its entirety, although, again, it is in Japanese, and the OVA was in English. They just didn't decide to localize this, I guess. But it's nice to see that it's fully voice acted, and the soundtrack absolutely slaps. Hell, and the goofy robot that Hikaru's parents show up in, while you might think that they're just messing with levers to make it look like they're doing something, clearly they are grooving to the soundtrack. Also, I need a gif of this immediately. They're just having a blast up there. If nothing else, the soundtrack to this game is worth giving a listen to because it's actually really genuinely quite good. The presentation to GranDoll is certainly a high point for it, in terms of consistency and quality. Now, if you want a copy of Hyperspeed GranDoll on the PlayStation 1, looking at it on eBay, well, first of all, I'm seeing a lot of copies of the DVD of the OVA for about $50. Oh, there's the soundtrack CD for about the same price. A bunch of Barbie stuff after that for some reason. Cheapest copy you can see on here is about $150. Wow. Now, you have to understand, I'm not playing the regular version, I'm playing the one that came in a cool pink box that actually comes with a second disc because this is the premium edition, and it actually costs the same price for some reason. So I guess if you want it, get the premium edition, you get a second CD with extra stuff in it. So that's cool, I guess. I didn't pay anywhere near that amount when I bought this. I think I paid $10, maybe $15 to Vermilion back in the day. And yeah, this is substantially more than I would recommend it at this cost, especially because, again, it's got a quiz in it, which means it's going to wall probably a few people. Certainly did me, and when I saw that, I took one swing at it and gave up, because the fact is, whenever you see a quiz in a platformer or some action game or, an import that you're actually really genuinely enjoying, yeah, that's a sign you're probably never going to actually see the ending to it. That's a big red flag for imports, and unfortunately, because of that, I can't readily recommend this one unless you just want to play like 4 levels of a really kind of janky maze-like 2D platformer with some interesting movement mechanics. It's stiff, it's janky, the bosses are awful for 2 specific different reasons depending on which boss you're talking about, but I still think it has a fair bit of charm, and I do kind of like this game. It's just a shame that, it does some of the worst possible things an import you might actually enjoy does. And the fact is, this game wasn't all that fantastic to begin with.